Okay. Mary Helen, you're up next.
I represent the Bellows Falls Downtown Development Alliance in Bellows Falls.
Great, thank you. Robert?
Yep, hi, I'm Robert McBride with the Rockingham Arts and Museum Project Ramp in Bellows Falls. And I'm also the Vermont Creative Network Southern Zone Coordinator that's over Bennington and Windham counties.
Great, thank you. Jeannie? Oh, I unmuted you. Oh.
Hi, I'm Jeannie Jenkins. I co-chair the Workforce and Education Group with Wendy Morse, who's also on, and I'm on the select board in Bennington.
Great, thank you. Wendy?
Hi, I'm Wendy Morse, Regional Manager with the Vermont Department of Labor, managing services in Bennington, Rutland, and Middlebury. I live in Bennington. I also co-chair Workforce and Ed with Jeannie.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Felicity?
I'm Felicity Rattay. I'm the chair of the Planning Commission in Brattleboro, and I'm here to learn something so I can help my fellow commissioners think ahead.
Great, thank you. Peter? Peter, can you hear us?
Okay,
There you are.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, my name is Peter Root. I'm the town administrator for the town of Guilford. I was just curious to see what other folks we're going to be talking about today.
Great, thank you. Bonnie? Bonnie, can you hear us? Bonnie, you're unmuted now.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, I'm the chair of the Planning Commission in Rockingham.
Great. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to pop up my presentation here and we'll get started. Okay, so this is the fourth in a series of four of webinars that I've been doing in the month of April for my program, the Southern Vermont Economy Project. And we are focusing on long-term impacts from COVID-19 for municipalities. Here is the sort of the series that has been happening in the month of April. And as you can see, along with this one, everything's being recorded and is on the website. And this is the fourth one there at the bottom. So the agenda, this is what the agenda is going to look like this afternoon. Jen's going to do a quick overview of what is economic development. Then we're going to show a few clips from a presentation that Joe Minicozy gave a week or two ago. Maybe it'll be about 7 to 10 minutes of video. And then we'll go back to Jen she's pulled out some screenshots of the slides that Minicozy used during the presentation, talk about that, and then have some discussion and questions. So Jen, I'm gonna stop sharing if you want to, let me ask you to share your screen.
Absolutely, hold on, this is, it's always a struggle for me. Okay, all right.
Are you able to hit share screen?
I think so. How's that?
Perfect.
What are you seeing?
Facilitating economic development.
Okay, good. One of the downsides is I can never tell what you see. So I made sure my Facebook wasn't open or anything crazy like that. So one of the really hard concepts, you know, for us is trying to remember to talk about economic development in different kinds of terms, because you know, it means something different at the local level versus regional versus state. And, you know, just as when we talk with our local partners and we have kind of different interests and needs from a regional agency, we have the same thing with the state. You know, we're a regional agency that interfaces with the state, and we don't all have the exact understanding of what economic development is or our role within it. So it's not obvious, and there's not going to be a test on this, but I pulled some slides from the ACCD's, what is economic development for communities PowerPoint, and I just wanted to, this is kind of the shared definition from the state. ACCD is the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. That's our state's kind of economic agency. Yeah, so that's, it's policy, it's all sorts of things, but the point is economic health of the community in addition to economic growth. And I always like to say growth can mean a lot of things. Growth can mean deepening and, creating something that's more equitable, more prosperity. It doesn't have to mean more all the time. So I just want to keep a broad kind of understanding of what that can look like to different communities and people. The general goals are, more and better paying jobs and growing a tax base, which tax base is also a very tricky definition because that means different things at different scales. Reducing poverty, getting to the point where we have enough to make sure that vulnerable people are not vulnerable anymore. And having a more stable and diversified economic base, really important goal at the region, for rural areas. An over-reliance on any particular sector creates a lot of risk. And so that's something we think about. It's kind of a complicated idea, and yet it's really obvious in our lives. We all try to find ways to mitigate risk. And then improve public services. I mean, a lot of the point of it is to create a thriving economy so that, we can have all of the library hours we want, so that the roads can be as safe as possible after every single storm. I mean, that is a lot of the goal of this. So it's really, and that's really what prosperous looks like at the community level. It means being able to create the most sort of supportive and safe and nurturing and exciting environment, and whatever that means for your town. So some of the local economic development actions are really sort of guided through some of the obvious stuff, municipal plans, your land use regulations, because land use is really what is your tie-in to sort of the greatest amount of your budget in terms of tax yield. And then local capital improvements program, that's sort of how you end up being able to, for instance, vision and implement, plan for and fund and implement real projects. So capital improvements, that can be everything just from basic infrastructure to things like, great community center stuff. The last thing I'm gonna say before I turn it back over to Sarah is this idea of scale is really hard because a lot of times I'll give you an example. We go to federal agencies for funding. The baseline funding for an agency like Wyndham Regional or for the RDCs like BDCC is pretty constrained. And so in order to do more things for communities and in the region, we go out and seek grants. The goals of the folks who are funding us are not necessarily the same goals that we have. So a lot of times I'm trying to write a grant to a national federal program that's like, you need to create more jobs. And I really need to create a program that helps people who are in our region who are not accessing the good jobs we already have because of various barriers to employment. And that can be anything from a lack of skills to a lack of awareness to a lack of transportation. So a lot of times the national goals for economic development, which is to create more jobs, which creates more income taxes, which is a lot of what the federal government needs, are not my goals regionally. We have to find a way to make those work. I'd say the same thing is true sort of at a local level. A lot of times when we go into communities and we say, we work on regional employment, and towns are like, well, we don't care because we don't have employers here. I'm like, but you have people who live there who have jobs and they pay their mortgage and that pays your taxes, and they pay their taxes and that pays your keeps your budget going in your town. So it's not that you have to have the same goals. I don't need you to say suddenly that you're going to create new jobs in your town, but we have to understand how what I do at a regional scale, my focus relates to what you're doing, and vice versa. How if you don't have some place for workers to live in your community, then I can't attract people to fill those great jobs. So we're all, we have our own self-interest, but we're all also connected in that way. And I will leave it at that.
Great.
Stop sharing, sorry.
Got it.
Cut me off.
Okay, so if any of you attended the Southern Vermont Economy Summit last year, you will recognize Joe Minicozy, who is our keynote speaker. And he's out of a firm called Urban 3. in Asheville, North Carolina, and he did this presentation a week or two ago. And so you'll see some things, you know, he likes to sort of repeat himself on some of these topics, such as like information biases, which I think is really important when it comes to the economy, because oftentimes, you know, we don't necessarily pull that side of thinking into how we go about our regional economy. So this first clip I'm going to play for you is just a little, you know, overview of information biases. And he, you know, naturally uses Tiger King as an example, if any of you have watched that show on Netflix. So it's fairly relevant. And then once that clip's super short, and then I'll jump to the bigger clip that gets into, you know, what COVID-19 is going to, or has already started to, how it's affected our economy. So let me hit play here.
We're all in a post-COVID society or a current COVID society, and we have some questions. And so to make this topical, I'm going to get to how I'm looking at the world and dealing with current issues and current events. And we'll start with Tiger King. So I've got a real problem with Carol Baskin. I'm just going to go ahead and say that I think that she's a bit of a hypocrite, watching what she's doing with cats and penning them in versus everybody else that she's criticizing. So I wondered, what about her cat density? You know, maybe she's got a lot of cats per acre or small acreage per cat, who knows? So doing the math, we pulled the cats of how many cats they have. We also threw in the urban 3 team of Josh and Kate. And on a cats per acre basis, actually Josh is the highest achiever in 93 cats per acre. But just looking at the show, from a show perspective, Carol Baskin, you know, she actually doesn't look so bad now. So it's made me question my bias that I thought she was maybe, you know, somewhat not inhumane to the cats. I still do think that she killed her husband, and I think that OJ agrees with me on this one. But it's going back to one of the core principles of urban 3, but also strong towns, is that when your information changes, your conclusion should as well, that we have to look at the biases that we bring to the table and understand the data. So my bias was that Carol was a hypocrite, and I've changed my bias because I looked at the data. So just a little warm-up exercise here to look at Tiger King in the light of lens of how we analyze the world. I wanted to start there, but I wanted to.
Great. So I thought that was really relevant, and I love that he uses, you know, current event things to kind of bring your mind to these topics that we don't necessarily, you know, think about on a day-to-day basis. The next clip I'm going to show you is from the same presentation, and you know, he's ultimately covering kind of the economic effect of COVID-19, and he sort of towards the end brings in this idea of fiscal resiliency for our towns and cities. So I'm going to go ahead and play that for you guys.
Density doesn't correlate to COVID spread. But the other thing that's happening with all of this, and we know that that's the virus effect, there's going to be an economic effect of all of this. All of our businesses being shut down or significantly altered, bars and restaurants closing. There's going to be a shift that's happening economically, and we're all getting ready for it. But this reminds me of what happened 10 years ago, that we were in this process when we saw that the music stopped and all of a sudden our economy collapsed in the recession. You could look at this as a bad thing, or you can say this is actually an incredible opportunity to see where the issues are. And part of the success of, I think, our message 10 years ago, and your message 10 years ago, Chuck, was that we could point out the obvious, that like, look, the economic system doesn't work because it's not moving, and you could see where the cracks are. So I think this is an incredible time for all of us to start looking at things and questioning it, and taking that, taking those opportunities to use data and science to analyze things and empower successful local decisions. So, you know, scientific method isn't about bloodletting anymore. We've got our brains around that. Scientific method is a data-driven process. So we could all be more fiscally resilient to do this, to look at data, to bring those you know, start doing the good things and stop doing the things that don't work financially for you. So as far as fiscal resiliency going forward, we always use this chart when I present, and I'll break this down a little bit in a second, but basically red is property tax, green, light green is sales tax, and the greenish blue is income tax or some other form. At a local level, at a city or a county, this is basically how you run your cash system. Going back to an old chart that we actually used at that assessors conference, here's what's going on at an economic level. So this is the flow of income tax. And you could see in a recession, we had a cratering out of our income tax. Well, following that is the retail sales tax. So if you don't have income, you're basically not buying things. So there's a correlation between income tax and losing your job, real simple. There's a lag effect, however, in what happens in property taxes. So it usually takes a couple of years for us to stop buying houses or the value of real estate to have that echo effect off losing jobs. So they're connected, but there's a delay. So the cities that are actually operating with property tax are going to be in a better position than the cities that are run primarily off retail taxes. So back to that chart, communities to the right of this chart are going to have more of a problem because of it's going to be more of an immediate loss of cash flow because of the drop in sales. And so just be aware of that. That's going to happen, measure it, pay attention to it, get data. Also, we're going to learn a very valuable lesson about reserve accounts. The businesses in the private sector that have built a reserve account can actually operate through this period easier because we've built a nest egg to start eating in bad times, the rainy day fund. States, cities, and counties should be doing the same thing. And there are states that don't have really good reserve accounts. Kansas has no money set aside in reserve accounts. Same with Illinois. Pennsylvania only has a 1%. Now, the states that operate with retail taxes, this is two maps you can correlate. Those that are predominantly retail tax heavy, great, but you're going to lose that money. So basically, these 4 states here are going to have the toughest time almost immediately going into it. So maybe this is a time to question, is this a good way to run your state's finances and your city's finances on a retail tax base? But at the very least, you need to start modeling it. You need to see what's going on from a retail tax perspective, and we recommend this to every community. Visualize it so you can see the scale and capacity, reward the stuff that's doing well, and don't go after the stuff that's not giving you hardly any return. So there's this constant analyzing of your revenue streams, your costing streams. One of the best examples that we have of this is Lancaster, California. Great team, great government, really good mindset of how they approach government is an interactive business cycle. I've shown this last presentation, the 953 miles of roads, but this is very much part of their ethos to question things, to interrogate all their data. This image is actually in their staff document about questioning everything that they do. And so at the end of the last recession, we interrogated their retail. And they had this mindset that the auto mall where you sell cars is a really good thing. And, you know, when you sell a car, there's a huge retail gain that you get. Well, guess what? People stop buying cars in a recession. So they felt that. And they're like, well, maybe we should look at other forms. And you can see here their downtown, their downtown's minuscule for a city their size. Their downtown should be stronger. But their downtown's not doing so bad compared to Walmart. When you look at the property taxes, this is retail tax. This is property tax. Downtown's killing it from a property tax standpoint. So from a total gain standpoint, the downtown's doing really well. So another bias that they had is that retail is going to come back. And this is going to be a bias that we're going to see coming into this current condition. So we measured it. If you look at their retail sales over time, you know, you could say, yes, they came back to 2006, but when you adjust for inflation, Josh McCarty adjusted this and was like, well, not so fast. There's a huge gap. They're still actually $2 million short of where they were if you adjust for inflation in retail transactions. So that's their drop in retail sales, $2 million bucks. So here it is. Now, what was crazy is through that period, as they were dropping retail sales, for some reason, the market was adding more retail square footage. Now, why would they do that? That makes no economic sense whatsoever. And the thing is it's not like you limit your permits, so you're not stopping that at a government level. Inside the market system, however, there is an incentive because we're not taxing it so much at a property tax level. You could throw away a couple buildings and try to eat other people's retail transactions, and that's what was happening. It was cannibalizing itself. But from a city perspective, you're losing property taxes and retail taxes. So that was an effect on their roads because they had to pay for that. They had to pay for all those 953 miles of roads, which will go from Los Angeles to Portland. So this is a chart that we showed that wave of that first wave effect of road. You didn't pay for it because the developers paid for it, but the second wave of rebuild, the third wave, and the fourth wave, these are all effects that they're feeling. So simply put, they owe, just stopping their roads and seeing what their cash flow is, about $50 million a year in road obligation. And Josh put together this chart to show them what their deficit is. So the different colors are the different funds inside California and the way their system operates. They have grants, metro contributions, impact fees, gas taxes, and sales taxes. This is their deficit. They can't really rely on grants or other metro contributions. So here's what they could rely on. So this is their true deficit, because you don't know if you're going to get a grant or not. And in a recession, when you compact all of these, this is what it felt like. They're walking right back into this cycle. Last cycle was the recession. This cycle is going to be because of COVID and the stopping of, we can't go shopping in anything other than a grocery store, basically. So taking this loss here and saying, well, what if we charged an additional fee, like a water, a stormwater fee or a sewer fee or things like that we do in other places? Could you do that just for your roads? Could you charge a fee? We know where they are. We know who drives on them. Incidentally, there are states that actually allow this: Utah, Texas, Colorado, or Oregon. California doesn't really allow it. Now, this might be a time to start asking for that and ask for that state policy to change. But anyway, we use this model to show them that when you have that fee, like think of it like a Netflix account or something like that, is a monthly charge for that utility, is more connected to the actual use. So when they saw that they were actually over, they're conservatives, they said, let's go ahead and compact everything else down so we're not so dependent on that stuff, and then we'll catch up to our cost. Well, in this coming recession, they'll actually be okay. So how we broke it down, it's not, they're still at a little bit of deficit, but not as bad as the last time. So things like cul-de-sacs, these are essentially publicly funded driveways. Like these, no one's driving out to drive on this cul-de-sac but for these 5 people here. So why is the community paying for the cost of that rehab of that road? And it's just not to say that you should charge them, but we should at least look at this and say, is this the public benefit? Is this going to be something that we want to spend our limited resources on for 10% of the system? Now that at a number, that's $2.5 million a year that goes to funding that 10%. Is that the best use of your $2.5 million? That's up to you. That's your community. The other thing is, radially going out of the city, those folks that choose to live furthest out are consuming more of the system. So the rate should be geospatial. The more that you go out, the more that you consume, the more that you pay. It seems only fair. So we came up with a ratio system of near to far or close to far. The further out, the more you're paying. The other thing in California is density matters. Actually, in most places, density matters with the property taxes. The more dense you are, the more productive you're going to be. So we came up with this 4-quadrant system that the furthest away and the lower the density, that's bad. That's the bad quadrant. You should be charged the most. If you're high density and far away, that's better, but it's not great. Conversely, if you're low density and close in, you're wasting the infrastructure because density matters from a property tax standpoint. And the sweet spot is you have high density and you're close in. So that's the most efficient use of the infrastructure. But these are the monthly charges to make their budget work properly. And it was kind of an interesting process to go through. What was more interesting was their response and how they utilized it. They got the logic of it. They understand the geospatial consequences. But then the easiest one to tweak was their stormwater system. They basically had an aha moment and said, this is good math. It's geospatially related. And our existing stormwater system doesn't work this way. So we're going to go ahead and just change that one because we can stop the leakage there. Every city is going to have to go through this. We're going to have to start finding where we're wasting our money and at least stop that bleeding, because we're going to have limited resources and revenues coming in the next 5 years. So this is going to be a smart way of thinking about this. We also have to think about how our brains operate. And there's...
Okay, we're going to stop there. I do have this link on the presentation that I can share with you guys. So if you want to watch this whole presentation, it's definitely worth it. All right, I'm going to hand it back over to Jen. She's going to pull some some of those screenshots out and go a little more in depth in relation to our state and our region.
Yeah, a little bit. I also, I'm wondering, like, Sarah, would you be okay to sort of manage the chat? Because I would love to it's a little hard to manage everyone, like, auditorially, but maybe if folks have like questions or comments about these, I'd love to put those out there. What I did is I just pulled a few of Joe's slides that relate to Vermont. I mean, one of the takeaways I hope that you all get from that is, like, Vermont as a state has positioned itself well, good rainy day fund situation, not a super reliance on sales taxes. And so that's, if you, next time you, see a state official or legislator, like it's a hard time, maybe affirm some of the good work that's been done, because the state's in an okay position. And that's, some of the really good news. I think the state is also, planning really aggressively to try to limit the damage and impacts at the local level. They're very, very cognizant of what this means, for towns, for sure. But one of the things I wanted to just get back to start with again is this local revenue sources by state. So, Vermont is kind of at the end of being really, really strongly reliant upon property taxes at the local level. And, we all know this isn't news to anyone, but just, in the I think it's interesting to see in the grand scheme of things where we are. But I think this is one of the most, if you take away one thing from this, as far as local long-term planning, I think this was a real eye-opener. I think this is one of the things that inspired Sarah and I to want to kind of share this more broadly, which is, we're all really aware of the retail and the hit there. And we know that what that means for rooms and meals, for 1% local taxes, for sales taxes, and that trickles down that effect from the state. And then, of course, income and a strong unemployment system response is going to mitigate some of that income tax hit in a way that was not the case back in the recession. So hopefully we'll see less damage, obviously, to individuals and to their households by having better support from the unemployment insurance this time around, but also we'll see hopefully a softer impact in the economy than we might have seen otherwise. But I think this deferred piece here, this property tax hit that kind of comes later, that lag, and we certainly saw that in Vermont. One of the pieces of research that I did a few years ago for the Futures Project was just looking at grand list performance. And at a state level, even 2 years out from the last recession, Vermont's grand list was simply not growing in value. And that is the result of three different problems, right? So they're not all necessarily problems, but they're three different factors. One is new things not being built, which, depending on where we're talking about, maybe that's definitely a good thing. And in some places, that's not a good thing if it's a downtown we're trying to revitalize, right? It's also a loss of people not improving properties, not, fixing up a home, not putting on an addition, not, renovating. And then the third piece is just the general market value that, even homes that where nothing was changing, they were still high quality and, in a desirable home, they just weren't growing in value because there wasn't demand and the real estate prices hadn't really picked up. That all feels great if you're sitting in your home and you're a taxpayer and you're like, yay, my house didn't appraise for more, or my property taxes didn't go up. But what that means is, that's a stagnation in revenues. And the reality is that government costs go up. Wages need to go up with cost of living. There's other inflationary costs. There's sort of a 2 to 3% very general minimum that we're going to expect costs to go up over time. We can hold budgets for a year or so, but at some point we have to make that up. If our revenue base isn't going up as well, at least at that rate, then we're falling behind and things have to be cut. So I don't think we're trying to propose here that any state, especially at this time, is going to undertake, or any town is going to undertake a massive rethinking about how things are taxed or paid for. But I was having a conversation with somebody once who, was a, sixth generation Vermonter, and they were talking about one of the sort of untold stories of sort of the back to the land movement, and then the sort of the development growth that then really felt really, really out of control in Vermont. And then sort of Act 250 came in. His point was he went from growing up in a state where there were very few paved roads, and therefore very little, road maintenance. The road maintenance cost was, sort of more about labor and grading and not, asphalt and all those things. And he said, even when we have pushed back on development and homes and, cutting down trees and, ruining the agricultural landscape, he's like, we never questioned all those roads that we now have and like to have, and everybody likes their road paved and, to pay for, and we still have to pay for it. And so we put the brakes on development, which is one of the ways that we try to bring up taxes to pay for the roads, but we kept those roads. And that's really that, those kind of bar charts that Joe Minikazi was showing is like, you get help to pay for the roads when someone, builds a road, or you come up with a bond, or the state helps you pay for it, but you still have to keep replacing them and repairing them. And we're in this really difficult time in rural America where we don't have ways to improve the productivity of our tax base, of our property tax base, and yet we still have to keep taking care of a lot of infrastructure, which is mainly roads in a lot of our towns. So not any easy answers, but really that's been like a death by a thousand cuts that has happened slowly in terms of how much less state and federal government pays for those, and sort of rising costs for those materials, and not rising costs of not rising value of the tax base. And I also say that because I think it's important to not beat ourselves up about it. Like this is math that has been moving not in our favor for a long time. And no one's done anything wrong. It's not because select boards made a lot of mistakes. It's just where we've ended up. But we still have to think about how we can maybe creatively deal with it. This last one, I love this slide because, I've seen various people show this as developers and say, hey, I know you want to have more stores and restaurants, but I can't make money off of anything other than residential right now, for instance. And so we know this, that the real demand out there is for housing of all different cost points, certain kinds of commercial or industrial, but that the retail space demand isn't really out there, that retail isn't growing, it's changing, it's evolving. Having said that, there are places like Bellows Falls and Brattleboro and Bennington that, that are hubs that are really more and more reliant on like experience, which is where it's going, culture and, like arts activities and performances and, sort of nightlife or day life, that experiential. And that is actually a sector that's been doing okay. Kind of, it's not so much retail, but it's sort of the experience side of retail, food and dining and arts. So I think that's, an advantage to continue to invest in. But I also love this slide because it touches on something that, makes everybody crazy, which is, you're like, why can't we get more help? Take Wilmington, for an example, Wilmington. Wilmington still has buildings in the center of its town that aren't redeveloped for a variety of different reasons, due to different ownership things and consequences of Irene, and even things that predated Irene. And yet, a dollar store can get built, in a town. And it's a lot of this is something we have to understand about the economics of it. And this is, if you become a Joe Minikazi fanatic, as we have, he really touches on how through our tax code, not just ours, the national tax code, we kind of incentivize, putting up a big box that's low density on a big piece of land that uses a lot of infrastructure and that depreciates over time. So it doesn't actually kind of boost our grand list over time. And again, this is the kind of thing that's worth examining. How could we do more to keep incentivizing, the redevelopment of the beautiful buildings in the center of Bellows Falls, and, put our investment into those things which produce, not only wonderful aesthetics, but activity and different kinds of activities. And also, frankly, tax yield per acre that far outstrips low density, box development. So, and then I just wanted to last thing throw out there that Vermont GIS. So for the last few years, local listers have been tortured by, towns have been tortured by the process of having to get all of the listers data online and to digitize it. But one of the great benefits of that is that your Vermont GIS folks, and we're going to have them on this summer and sort of play around with this stuff some more when they're not so overwhelmed with COVID-related services. They have taken your town data and they have done some of these Minikazi visualizations. So they're putting the last round up when, Sarah, like a month? By the end of the month,
yeah, could be ready as early as today, but yeah, I'd say early May.
So if you go to this, and we can share this this link with you, you can actually see your own town, and those visuals that are color coded by different kinds of, commercial versus residential, I think, versus, public, private. But then they're also kind of the height of them is their tax productivity. So they've done this, there's all different kinds of analysis and maps on there, but it's really fun. And in that vein of what Sarah led with, with the Minakazi presentation, questioning your assumptions about where there's more value to be grown, where, you're really getting benefits, what's worth spending time on. We're going to spend a lot of time on tweaking our zoning. Where's there really, some improvement to be made in terms of tax productivity or cultural activity or things like that. So I encourage you to go to the GIS website for the state and mess around. It's pretty fun. It's a little overwhelming. Try to be on a good computer because it takes a lot of processor because of the platform that they're using. But yeah. Great. So I think that's, Sarah, you're going to do another bit before we talk about the state, right?
No, I think
okay.
The stuff I have is just sort of discussion things as well as some reading if people are interested. So
are there have some people put some things in the chat? Is there anything?
No questions, but I want to maybe pause here and ask if there is anyone that has questions or comments based on the stuff that we've just sort of reviewed. And if you want, feel free to unmute yourself to ask that question. Okay, let's keep moving.
Great. So I'm going to pull it back up to the state level again. None of us has a crystal ball. The state doesn't have a crystal ball. They don't know exactly what's going to happen, not just in terms of their own planning, which I know that everyone's working feverishly on figuring out how to try to have the smoothest path forward possible, especially for towns. But there's not a real understanding. There's been an initial federal package in terms of relief. But there's no sense of what's going to happen going forward as far as federal relief to states and then on to towns. So I think, at this point, just thinking about, again, I mean, your state's really healthy and Vermont has done a great job of positioning itself. But I think one of the messages from the Minakazi stuff is like, this is a slow, I mean, what we're feeling now feels so huge, but it's just the most visible, the restaurants closing and those, consumption taxes coming down, but that's probably the beginning of a longer, slower burn. And so the state's going to need to figure out, and towns are going to have to figure out how to, make that rainy day fund last, how to kind of weather, potentially a couple of years of the sort of long tail of the consequences. One of the things I've been looking at is a different way of looking at it's the state's revenue is, so I love this. This is from Pew. This just came out like last year. It's, it's pretty current. So I think when I look at this, I start to think about, okay, what does this mean, for the state funding and then how that passes back down into towns. And, Vermont has like the most even mix almost of any state on the thing. It's really interesting. And it's, and it really speaks to, what Vermont has done over the long term in terms of, sustaining really high bond ratings, which were sadly downgraded more about because of demographic issues. But as far as fiscal responsibility and also a diversified base. But, as we see what the consequences are in terms of income taxes or sales, and then ultimately property tax implications for this crisis, this is one way that we can try to guess at what that's going to mean for the state. This one really kind of, this is a study by, I think it's a National Association of State Budget Officers. And so what's weird is the peaks are actually cuts. So they're basically, it's showing you the level of budget cuts made at by states, and then how long it took to sort of get back to kind of normal. I thought this was probably one of the better ways to understand this. If we think about the last recession, it was really like a 2-year budget cycle. that that significantly impacted the state level. And then that's kind of dropped off, maybe half as much pain. And then, kind of went back to the normal consistent level of pain. So, again, just trying to think like, what's the time frame? And, because we're living day to day with this and we have no idea, am I going to work next week or in a month or whatever. But as a town, official or someone on a commission or a board, kind of our job is to take a step back and be like, okay, are we changing the way we do business? And if so, how and for how long? And so when we were talking to businesses all the time in the first weeks, and people kept saying, well, you're asking me about the impact on my business. What's the time frame? And we were like, we don't know. So it becomes a circular problem. But at some point we have to get some information and say, well, this is enough information. I'm going to assume that for 2 years, this is going to really hurt. And that's how I'm going to start planning. And that may be a little too conservative, maybe not conservative enough, but it's enough for us to start having conversations about, our town budget, about, committee actions, about whatever it is, about projects. So, and I just sort of want to throw these ideas out there and then kind of open it up to a little bit of chat and discussion. The ones that have asterisks next to them, I did that in part to just say these aren't our ideas. This is things that we've been hearing from folks as we've been asking questions. And on last week's webinar, I heard the first one is, are projects ready to hit the ground running as conditions allow? And that was something Patrick Moreland from Brattleboro really emphasized, that he is taking this time, now that they've sort of adjusted to the new mode of business, to make sure that as soon as they can get back out there and do things and do projects, they are ready to do that, because there's been time lost, and every minute lost, is higher cost and, other different consequences. So, that was a great insight. One of the things, number 2 is, do you have other project financing options if your town budget is reduced? One of the things SVEP, that Sarah's program, tries to do all the time is to try to find excuses to bring towns and nonprofits and our locals together with different funders, and to make sure funders know about what you're doing, and that is a relationship that for us is, it's the most rewarding, invisible thing that we do. When we get a call from X foundation that's like, what do you know about things that are going on in Y category, and we're able to share or refer them to people, we know we're making a connection that's going to make a difference. And we're not doing it. We're not the people funding it, but we know that a resource is meeting a need. And in this time, we want to make sure that rather than just putting everything on pause, that we say, well, if a project had enough support to be funded by a town, and voted in by the voters, but now there's a problem with the town budget, that says that it's enough of a priority to look elsewhere. Do we need to look at USDA? Do we need to see if there's some other kind of financial tool that can make that project possible? And so I want folks to think carefully and conservatively, but also creatively. And there's more funding for a lot of federal programs right now, and they don't all know what to do with it. And if you have a shovel-ready project, you might be an answer to their prayers, which is some place to meaningfully put some of that program money on the ground. All right, number 3 should probably be number 1. Just want to make sure everyone's taking care of themselves and avoiding burnout, because we talk to folks all the time in towns, and you're the kind of people who work tirelessly anyway. And then something like this comes along. And is something I've heard from the folks who went through the Irene crisis together at the town level. I've heard this from state level officials, who went through that, understanding that a natural disaster goes on forever, and this may go on, for months and months, maybe even, more than a year or so. And that taking care of yourself so you can take care of your communities is okay, and it's great. I'm just going to keep saying that because other people have thought it was important enough to say to us. And I'll rip through the rest of these, but are you considering different scenarios? Do you have a resilience plan for your organization, for your town? We've all done them internally just for each of our jobs. And they can be as simple as, Sarah's going to have to answer all my emails, which is part of my plan. But, I encourage you to really establish a high bar for what total recovery looks like. It's why I put it in capitals. because again, I use the Wilmington example that they have done an incredible job of doing everything that was laid out for them post Irene, and yet it hasn't been enough to hit every single benchmark. You know, there are businesses that have not reopened or that continue to fail for years after Irene. There are buildings that are still empty, and there's, you know, population that didn't ever return. That doesn't mean they're not still working on it. And now is a good time to really think about like what you think that, you know, as you figure out what the impacts are, hopefully there are not that many locally, but to establish an expectation that you will meet or even exceed sort of restoring everything lost to, you know, to good health. And then like, are there new opportunities and new perspectives? You know, there folks already are talking about, you know, there are people who are here because they have chosen to shelter in Vermont because it feels safer and more manageable than being, you know, in cities. And what's the opportunity there for, you know, welcoming folks to be here long-term, for instance, if that's what your community desires. And then identifying gaps. And I want to leave on this one, or I'll stop talking on this one. But I felt like it was also such an important point that was made by Gretchen Haverluck last week about how they realized kind of during Irene that the shape and size of some of the programs for businesses that are typical federal disaster response was not the right shape and size for sort of what was needed in that community. And that there's a variety of reasons for that. Some of that has to do with like not having county government and things like that, which is how most federal programs operate. But the point being, you know, the federal response is what it is and the state response will be what it is, but it's likely that there will be some local and regional needs that are maybe not perfectly met. And seeing those and raising those issues, you know, to us, to the regional commissions, to your legislators is really important because all that is fungible. You know, we're in the process right now at BDCC, we just got permission from the USDA to take a lending program where we had to charge 7% because we borrowed from them at a certain rate, and that's what we have to do. And they gave us permission to reduce that. And so we can loan money at something that's really comparable to what the federal government is loaning businesses. And that's great. That's a, you know, we went back to them and said, we have businesses who are not going to access this federal program. Could we provide something comparable? And they said yes. And that was based on feedback. So I encourage you to be like vocal and loud as programs come out from, you know, various agencies and levels of government and say, that's nice, but here's the 3 problems in my town that doesn't solve. Because that's the only way we're going to create new solutions. So.
Great, thank you, Jen. So now I wanted to, you know, open it up to all of you that are on this call. You know, you don't need to have questions, but I would love to hear sort of your thoughts based on all that we just breezed through in a quick hour. So yeah, I would love to hear from some of you. Oh. Hold on, Robert.
Everybody.
Hold on. Unmute, come on. I want to let me. Robert, can you unmute yourself? There you go.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. I know, Jennifer, when you're comparing Vermont to other states, you sort of referenced that we were in a kind of a good position with our rainy day fund and stuff. Can you talk a little bit about more of the specifics of what that means, or how we are in a much better position, or figures a little bit? Because I think, you know, probably my conception would be that we would be in a horrible position. We're a small state, we rely on tourism and all that's crashing. So what are some of these reserves the state has smartly?
Yeah, I mean, it's all relative, right? I mean,
Okay,
you're right.
sure.
The revenue, you know, the revenue is not great, you know, and the rainy day fund is, you know, it's supposed to be there for a rainy day. I mean, what it means is that you have some money to mitigate some of that pain. And I think there was a great article that Sarah shared with me this morning that was about Burlington's response. You know, they are very much like the state. They have a pretty big rainy day fund, and they're using it to mitigate some of the immediate pain that they're feeling. But they're also, you know, really trying to caution everyone against wanting to spend it all at once, because so they're trying to convey that sense that this is going to be of a year or more duration as far as budget impacts, and that the rainy day fund needs to be there for next year. So we're going to still have to make hard choices. The rainy day fund isn't there to put off hard choices because it's not enough to offset all of those. Yeah, and we will see. I mean, I think that there's a variety of, I don't have any sense yet, and we have the federal delegation folks come and talk on 2 different calls every week, and we go on some other webinars too, and I don't think there's any sense of like, you know, is the whole for states this big and the federal government's going to come up with this size of solution? Like there's no sense or proportion even, much less what that means. All that to say, like, I don't know. I don't think anyone knows.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is Peter.
Go ahead, Peter. Thanks.
Well, just kind of touching on that, one of the issues with, at least as far as Guilford is concerned, with our rainy day fund is we have a policy in place regarding the rainy day fund, and if you know, if we do use it during this time, which it can be used during this time, we have to go back and bring it back up at a later date up to a minimum certain amount. So for us, it has to be funded at a minimum of 5% of that most recent approved budget at town meeting. So if it's brought down to 0 or brought down below that 5%, we have to bring it back up to that. So that's going to pose other problems for us as well.
That's such a great point, Peter, because I also, you know, as you know, I get to go to a bunch of different town meetings, and there was a really nice discussion at Guilford town meeting this year, and there's even sort of thanks to former leadership for having, you know, set up a capital fund, right? And, you know, which is something that not every town has. It's like sort of, they don't necessarily, they do the same practices, but they don't have that kind of capital reserve fund set up in that same way. And so I think, again, like this is maybe not a time to revisit every single practice, but maybe it is. You know, maybe this is a great time when towns say, wow, we should have sort of more policies around a rainy day fund, and maybe a different way of coming at our capital planning, because this is illustrating how, you know, those things really help you weather the tough times. You know, the easy times, you don't need any of those things. So,
well, just tying into what you just said, Jen, I think the other concern for us is that if we do have a budget shortfall for FY21, how is that going to impact our capital projects that we have planned out?
Right.
Because, I mean, theoretically, that is one area that we could make cuts to our budget without necessarily having a long-term negative impact. It would be short-term pain, but yeah, it's hard to judge what the best area is going to be to cut. And for example, at our select board meeting on Monday, this past Monday, they decided, so we had in our capital plan, which we do, all of our 1-ton trucks that our highway department use are to be replaced every 7 years. And so we had one that was scheduled to be replaced, and the select board decided to continue on and to replace it, despite the fact that we really have no answers as to what's going to happen next year. And we could use that $90,000 for this upcoming year if it was really absolutely necessary. But they didn't want to defer that pain, and that could impact the work that the road crew need to do even with a limited budget next year.
Thanks, Peter. I appreciate it. Jessica, you typed in a whole paragraph into the chat function. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just touching on that.
Sure. So I'm on the Planning Commission in Brattleboro, and I also am the director of an arts service organization, and I'm an artist myself. So I was talking a little bit in my comments about you know, the difference, because the presenter that you were showing us was comparing this recession to the last one. I just wanted to bring up the fact that arts organizations and cultural events, we have a lot of data that they drive a lot of downtown spending and vibrancy and activity. And through the 2008 recession, arts organizations actually, they were one of the industries that actually survived pretty well and stayed economically more solid than a lot of other industries. And I think that, that was a big help to downtown recoveries, and particularly in restaurant and retail. But with this whole new situation where public gatherings and public events are going to be really limited, and the organizations that I work with, some have shut down through the end of the summer. Some are thinking they may need to put programs on hold for a whole year. Some are thinking maybe longer than that, depending on vaccine production and public safety and health requirements and limits on how big gatherings can be and the sustainability of that for their organization. So I think that that's really, for Southern Vermont, we have a significant number of arts organizations and arts events and festivals that drive tourism, that drive downtown traffic, that drive, the market to restaurants and downtown businesses. And I think that at least needs to get acknowledged when we're thinking about what recovery looks like and what we can lean on, and what maybe we might want to invest in the long term to ensure that once public gatherings are viable, that these businesses can really launch and help us bring people back to the downtowns.
Yeah, and one thing I want to say on that is, I, as a person who does a lot of data for a lot of people, I never am happy when people take a current trend and extrapolate it forward, because I'm like, that's not how this works, there was a moment, my husband is a museum curator and historian, and he, a lot of the staff at his organization are not, they're kind of, they're administrative people. And which I'm very sympathetic, because that's what I am, but there was a lot of like, oh, people are never going to come back to museums because they're closed indefinitely right now. And, but honestly, I believe, and he believes, and I think a lot of us, who understand the value of cultural activities believe that the opposite is true, is that there's going to be such a pent up demand for that kind of experience. And our real challenge is to find ways to help organizations survive and mitigate the damage right now, and then be poised to take advantage of that. That to me is kind of the ideal. It's a terrible scenario because it means survival is probably the best thing we can hope for right now for many of them. But driving as much local, I think the Brattleboro Business Alliance, Downtown Alliance has done an amazing job of making it really easy for people to spend at restaurants through gift cards, through takeout, making sure that we are driving as much resources as we have locally while we don't have those external visitors to sustain those organizations while they kind of hunker down and hopefully are poised for sort of a blossoming. And that's really a thing. I think it's really dangerous to take anything that's happening now and say, well, that's the end of having people, visit Vermont. That's not what that means at all. And we can't let it, and I think we have control over these things. So yeah, it's really important, the story that we tell about this stuff. And also, understanding where to put resources. I think there was a point in the Minakazi thing where he talked about, there are businesses that have cash reserves like a town or a state, and they are able to weather this storm. What we're seeing is the businesses hardest hit earlier, not only retail and outward facing that rely on traffic of humans, coming in and out and buying things and interacting. It's also the kinds of businesses that tend to have the lowest cash reserves. They are the most fragile. And they don't necessarily employ the most people or pay the highest wages, but they are that kind of stimulus of the entire economy. And they're also what makes our region special and great. And so that is where a lot of resources and attention need to go, is on those cultural drivers, which I think of as all of it. It's the latches, it's a restaurant, it's anything, so that's really about that special something that Southern Vermont has.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is Robert McBride again. I think that even though we've all been thrown into this total, solar eclipse, we're all in the dark about possibilities, we still are in the present. And I think with artists and arts organizations, as much as they're devastated and contracts have canceled and performances on hold indefinitely, I think that offers certain opportunities for us as organizations and artists to continue to create and participate in the community and sort of keep the community intact, So it's not like we're not suffering like everyone else isn't suffering, but I think if we all apply our creative abilities to keeping the communities intact, and that's what we're lucky about in Vermont, our low demographics, 600,000 people in the state, how do we keep a tribe in Bellows Falls functioning? We're not dealing with millions of people. I think there's opportunities in that that are really significant and psychologically significant to keep everyone's balance going,
Great, thanks, Robert. Wendy, would you mind unmuting yourself and just making a comment on the census? Very relevant, and I appreciate you bringing that up.
So I just saw through the census website that Vermont ranks number 4 in terms of the worst for states to complete their census, with roughly 43% being completed. If that stat holds true, I mean, that's obviously going to impact all of our federal investment dollars coming into the state. At the same time, over the course of, at least the next 2 years, we're anticipating some changes to revenue streams coming to, the state and municipalities. So I'm just, curious as to how that's going to be impacting our strategies going forward in terms of both growth and sustainability.
Yeah, no, it's, I'm really happy that you, sort of sought that out, because we're in the same boat, and more as, we're under the, we know that the census counting is going on, and the fact that Vermont and actually Windham County is even, is one of the worst counties as far as percentage counted. As our organization and a lot of towns and nonprofits that rely on, federal and state funding, which really relies on the census data. And so this has definitely been on our radar. We actually just yesterday had a conversation with a woman out of the New York office for the Census Bureau, but her territory is Southern Vermont. And we're going to be, I believe, on May 20th, hosting a webinar, similar format in a way to this, around, getting as many people counted as possible in Southern Vermont, and ideally the state. But so we'll have on organizations and municipalities talking about that importance of having the correct data through the census. And, Teresa, who's the woman that works for the Census Bureau, will, sort of briefly go over some, they have all sorts of media kits and that type of stuff that people, organizations, and towns can use to help get the word out and get people counted. And I think, something that's really important to realize is that this time period was really when people were going to be out and about knocking on doors to help sort of the people who haven't been counted yet get counted. But so we're in this unique situation where they can't do that anymore. And so we all really have to step up, and it's like, easier than ever to do the census this year. So it's sort of this, like, how do we get that word out about it being, you can just call up and do the census over the phone, so that we get the right amount of money allocated in these federal and grant programs.
Yeah, and I'm wondering too, if that's awesome. I'm glad to hear you guys are doing that. I'm just wondering too, if that's something that could be, live broadcast through, one of the local access television stations that also do, Facebook Live or something like that as a conjunction, because I feel like people don't understand the importance of completing that census as much as, all of the federal public service announcements are made. When it hits home and it's impacting you and your community and your livelihood as a community, I think that's when people start to realize why they have a part in that too. The other thing I just wanted to like quickly put out there, and this is just another stat that I heard this morning, and this came directly from Tech Center Director, but the Department of Education is anticipating $150 million loss to revenue streams for next year to the education fund as a result of COVID. So just looking at sort of workforce development also being that economic, driver or supporting the economic driver, I don't think we should discount that piece too, because that's also another element that I think could have long-term impacts on our sustainability going forward.
Yep. I just like to add a couple of resources. This is making me think of some outreach resources abilities. One is that, I think a program about the census on a local cable access show, if it hasn't been done, would be great. I do a show on Fact TV called Everyday People. We could do it on that one, and then we could upload it to the bibliography of all the cable access stations throughout the state for them to download and stuff. So I think that's one way to reach a very local population. And I think Wendy and Sarah are right. I mean, I think, we're sort of generally clueless how important it is for the economic part to get these things filled out. So that's just come more to the top of my list of something I should be pushing in my constituency through the artists and creatives. But also as being part of the zone coordinator for the Vermont Creative Network for Bennington and Windham over the last several months. In my office, we've put together an email list of what is termed creatives in Bennington and Windham counties. This is organizations, individual artists, and other businesses that people do. And right now we have about 500 names, email names on that list that, and they're good emails. We'll send out a thing and we'll get 2 returned or changed. So we developed a really effective list to reach in our 2 counties, these creatives, however people determine themselves. And anyone on the call, I'm more than happy to, if there's announcements, I do these e-blasts, like every couple of weeks of opportunities, events, stories. So if anyone on this call would like to talk to me or what they're working on, they'd like to make sure we're included in an e-blast or something, I'd be happy to convey that information to our larger group. Sarah's on my committee, which helps. And, I'm trying to bring more of the Southern Vermont Economic Project stuff to the forefront. I think the more that the arts and economic impact is really realized as one seamless connection of the economy, it's really, really great. So you can all get in touch with me individually, just ramp@soffer.net or Robert McBride at the Rockingham Arts Museum Project. I'd be more than happy to share ideas or this list, not share the list with you, but post things to our newsletter.
Great, thank you so much, Robert. If there are no other comments, it is 1:15, so I just want to be respectful of people's time. Last call for comments before we jump off here. All right. So this will be posted to the Southern Vermont Economy Project webpage, and you can find that at brattleborodevelopment.com. And on that, I will also post the presentations, which have the links and whatnot in them. And I believe I have most, if not all, of your emails, so I can also send you that stuff via email as well. So thank you all for joining. Keep doing the good work.
Take care of yourself.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye. Great.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.